Disciples of Jesus are often criticized. And you may have experienced a similar criticism that we're going to talk about today. Sometimes people will criticize because they do something that we don't do, and they think that they're better, more holy, more righteous than us because they do something that we don't do. Or, in the opposite, sometimes we do something that they don't do, and because they don't do it, they think they're more holy or righteous or better than us. Jesus is going to respond to those criticisms that applies to his disciples of that day and even to the disciples of today. So if you have your Bibles, and you should, turn to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2, and we're going to start with verse 18. And as you're turning there, it says this. John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and they came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" So see, we do something that you don't. We fast. Now, I want you to understand something. The only biblical requirement to fast in the Old Testament under the law was one day, the Day of Atonement. That was the only day that the people of God were to fast during that one time. However, the Pharisees, wanting to be pious, fasted twice a week. It was usually Mondays and Thursdays. They did so because they wanted to appear religious and better than everybody else, and so they fasted. And we're going to see what Jesus' response to this criticism is. And Jesus said to them, "While the bridegroom is with them, the attendants of the bridegroom cannot fast, can they? So long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the day will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and they will fast in that day." So Jesus says, your situation is different from the disciples' situation, where you see the bridegroom, the Messiah, is present with them, and there is a celebration. So I want you to kind of get, Jesus is the Son of God. Emmanuel, God with us. Why would you want to mourn and fast when you're in his presence? Now, the disciples of John were looking forward to the day of the Messiah, and were fasting to hope that that day came and to cry out for that day. But the disciples of Jesus are walking and listening and teaching and hearing Emmanuel, God with us. And so during a party, you do not fast during the party. And Jesus says, when the bridegroom is there, and so the question refers to, there's going to be a day in heaven called the marriage supper of the Lamb. Is that an appropriate time to fast? No, that's a time to celebrate. And Jesus is saying, I'm with them. This is not the time to fast. Now, I want you to kind of see that fasting can be of some value. But usually when we actually do a fast, sometimes people will fast because they're trying to clear their minds or do something. But if you will, a genuine fast comes, and I want to give it an example in the scriptures. David, when he was told that the child that was consummated by his and Bathsheba's adulterous affair, that God would take the child, David fasted. David cried out to the Lord. David didn't bathe because he was consumed with the grief of the thought of losing a child. And he tried and tried and tried to get God to change his mind. And sometimes there may be things in our lives that we are crying out to God that are so important to us that we fast and we pray and we do these things. So there are times when there's this felt need to fast. when is it appropriate to fast? But notice in David's situation, once the child died, David ended his fast. He took a bath and ate. Because he said, perhaps while the child was alive, I could get God to change his mind. But when he didn't, then blessed be the name of the Lord. And so there are appropriate times in our lives when we may seek to fast because there's something so overwhelming in our lives. We want God to either come in or change or do whatever. The second thing I find interesting is when Jesus does tell us to fast, when we do fast, no one will know it. Because Jesus says when you fast, don't look like you're fasting. Have a smile on your face. Make sure you're bathed. Do something so that the rest of the world doesn't know that you're fasting. Because you're doing it not for pious sake, but because you're doing something that's internal. So even if the disciples were fasting, and Jesus says, no, that's not the time, they would have known it because Jesus' teaching is, don't show your religiosity, make it personal. It's like when we go into our prayer rooms to pray. It's not to pray to look holy. It's to commune with God. And so these are the things and so the people who are fasting twice a day and thinking we're not holy or pious because we don't want, either there isn't that opportunity for the need, or they will never know because we have been instructed not to make it obvious. And then Jesus is going to give them a patch of unshrunken cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the patch will pull away from it, and the new from the old, and a worse tear results. Now, for those of us who aren't into patching or doing those types of things, basically, if you take a new piece of garment, especially in those days, because they didn't have pre-shrunk clothes, that if you had a holy garment, in today's world, I guess it would be holy jeans, because everybody now pays more money for holy jeans than for good ones. But you say, okay, all of a sudden maybe the style changed and you're not supposed to wear holy jeans, so you would want to put a patch on them to look like you're cool again. And so Jesus says you wouldn't take a non-pre-shrunk cloth, a new one, and put it on an old garment, because when you wash it, the new one will shrink, which will cause the stitching, and you'll rip the old garment, and now it's worse off, and you can't use it because there's a bigger hole. And then he uses a second example. No one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. He says, if you're going to put new wine into an old wineskin, the problem is the old wineskin has already expanded because of the fermentation process. And so it is given all the elasticity that it can because it's already moved during the fermenting process. So he goes, if you put new wine in to allow it to ferment, then it will stretch the wineskin beyond its ability and will burst. And not only have you no longer, before you could at least put water in it or some other type of liquid, but once the wineskin is broken, it's unusable, and you've now lost the contents, the wine. And Jesus is saying, I'm not putting my new teaching, I'm not putting what I'm doing into the old system, because the old system is only concerned about the old system. I'm doing something new, and I'm not going to bother putting my new wine, the wine of the new covenant, into an old system. The old system got off track because the old system was the do's and the don'ts rather than faith, which the old system was originally designed for. For Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. That was always the plan. It was never these things you do and these things you don't do, and therefore that impresses God. It's always been faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. And so Jesus is saying, I'm not taking the old about how many times you fast or don't fast. It's not about the outward appearance. It's about the heart. And then they're going to get criticized again. And it happened that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath is always going to be a controversy for the Pharisees and Jesus and his disciples. And in the next message, we're going to see the controversy again. But so they're passing through the grain fields on a Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. Now, first, I want you to understand, they're not stealing. Because under the law, the owner of the field was never allowed to harvest the entire field. They were to leave the corners untouched, and they were also not to use sickles. They were to, so that there would be grain that would fall on the ground, and they were not allowed to pick it up, because that was in essence their benevolence situation. Those who were in need could come to the fields and find the grain. We see during the time of when all of a sudden I had who's the lady with Boaz? Ruth, right. Ruth, how could you forget Ruth? Ruth harvested so much because Boaz so favored her that she had more and more than she could do. But again, that was the way you had benevolence. And so when the disciples are walking through, they're not stealing. They're simply saying, we're hungry, we're in the midst of traveling, ministering, and therefore they're taking some grain that has been left as is appropriate. So they pick the heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Again, we don't do things like that on the Sabbath because it's the Sabbath. We have made the Sabbath such a vehicle of holiness that they're not supposed to do this. Now, it's interesting. The scriptures say that we are to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. They made all kinds of rules and regulations. There were only so many places, so many feet that you could walk on a Sabbath. There's only certain things that you could do or not do. And they had all these rules that were not connected in reality to remembering the Sabbath and keeping it holy. Remembering the Sabbath means God rested on the Sabbath. He's the one who created it all. I'm going to give him thanks and think about him and worship him and honor him. And I'm going to keep that day separated from all the other days. It's not necessarily rule keeping. It's understanding who God is and worshiping him. So he responds to them this way. And he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. He also gave it to those who were with them. So Jesus says, I want to give you an example of something that happened. Now, the commentators somewhat are kind of confused why David is used in this instance, so I'm going to try to help to explain that. David came and Saul was seeking to kill David and his companions. So David took off in a hurry. They didn't have any weapons. they just got out of there as quick as they can because they didn't want to die. Because Saul wanted him dead. Now this was after David had killed Goliath. And so, because of the travel and whatever and the ecstasy of the situation, David and his men were hungry. So they go to the tabernacle. And they say, "You got anything to eat?" And the answer is, the only thing we have to eat is the bread that's on the table of showbread. Now, the table of showbread, what would be, was there would be 12 loaves of bread placed in the holy place, and each day they would have new bread, and each loaf represented one of the tribes. And then the following day they would take that bread out and put new bread in, and there would be that constant offering. But the only people who were allowed to eat the bread was the priests. But there's nothing else to eat except this bread. And the only quote-unquote lawful ones to eat it are the priests. And what happens is the high priest says, "Okay, you can have it." Because the situation is good always trumps rules. These men were hungry, they were famished, and while it was only lawful for them to eat, somebody was there who was, I don't want to say important, but important. David was the anointed king, although not the acting king. David was the one who stood in front of Goliath and said, "I'm not going to allow you to challenge my God. And even though no one thinks I can, I'll come out and I'll fight you because you're an affront to my God." And so he went and he slew Goliath, and that sword was in the tabernacle. And after the incidents that happens here, David's looking for weapons. They said, "Well, we got the sword of Goliath." He goes, "I'll take it." You see, David showed righteousness because he was unwilling to allow anyone to curse God. And so the good was, you're hungry. I'm going to permit it. Now, notice David didn't go into the Holy of Holies and get it. It was done so by the priests. So it was consented to. All too often, we're so worried about our rules that we would forget why the rules were instituted. And Jesus said to them, I'm having food again. Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath." Jesus, why did God institute this? He didn't institute this so that the Sabbath would rule over men, but that men would understand that they needed rest, they needed communion with God, they needed to make it wholly separated so that they might have an opportunity to remember who their Creator was, to remember who was the one who was providing for them, to remember the one who was blessing them. Because let's face it, we all get busy in our lives. We all go to work, and then we do those things, and then there's the kids, and there's dinner, and all these things, and we're wrapping up, and we're so consumed by doing things that sometimes we forget what's best. So what God says, I want you to have a Sabbath so you have an opportunity to not only rest from your labors, but to concentrate on God, to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. It was instituted for our benefit, not our benefit, for the benefit of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was for us, not us for the Sabbath. But then Jesus is going to say something, again, why I think he uses this particular passage, because David going into and getting something had nothing to do with the Sabbath. It's this. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. You see, the first time he said, the bridegroom is with them. So why should they fast? They should be celebrating because Emmanuel, God is with them. And now he's saying, there's someone here even greater than David. The priests allowed David and his companions to eat the holy bread because of a situation. Jesus is saying, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not Lord of me. Someone greater than David is here. And if I say it's okay, it's okay. Because it is not the rules, but who they're with. So, give you an example. When we get to heaven, are you going to be happy saying, you know, I'm really glad on February 9th, 2025, I was at church? Or are you going to say, I'm really glad I'm in the presence of Jesus? Somehow I don't think today is going to be that much impressive to you as to being in the presence of Jesus. Now, I know I'm a fantastic guy, and I know that you can't wait for my next words to say because I'm that interesting. But even as interesting as I am, and as compelling as I am, I fade in comparison to Jesus. And Jesus saying, you guys are so ruled on what day to do what, then who's with you? I am the Son of Man. The Son of Man, Emmanuel, God with us, the one who is God that we can understand in the flesh, appearing with us and for us, is Lord even of the Sabbath. He is Lord of all. Some have said if he's not Lord of all, he's not Lord of any. But he is Lord of all. And so, when we decide, should I do this or should I do that? What is good? What is the best? Is being hungry better than providing for those who are famished or following a rule? Is it better to go to a party and say, I'm sorry, I can't eat any food because I'm fasting? Or you go to the party and don't let anybody know you're fasting? Or if it's Jesus' party, you celebrate. What a sad situation to be in the presence of Jesus and be in mourning. Say, oh, poor is me. Oh, woe is me. Things are terrible. As opposed to, things just got better. Because my Lord and my God is with me. And I'm with him. And he's protecting me. And he's providing for me. And he's loving me. And he's forgiving me. And he's going to give me ultimate victory. I don't think that's so sad. I think that's a reason to have a party. And that's a reason to say, it's okay if you judge me by what I do or don't do. Because you'll change your mind tomorrow. But I'm going to do what he wants me to do. Because I'm following him. And if he says it's okay, and I don't care what you think. And if he says it's not okay, and I don't care what you think. Because he's my Lord. He's my master. He is the Son of Man, the Son of, and the Lord of the Sabbath. He is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And it is not what I do that makes me holy. It is because of who he is, the Holy One, that makes me holy. And I'll remember him. And all God's people said.